So let me hear you. Good and loud. All right, Gary. On one. On two. On three. Take me out to the...
The Monday Morning Quarterback on the 30th of July, 2018. The last program of July. Unbelievable. We made it through an unusually hot summer thus far. Over the Boston Red Network and WBRN Radio we go. We have a Boston story here from the Washington Post of homicides of African Americans nationwide. The number, too many. The number of solved crimes, too few. Just an observation. The Post has the numbers, and we'll get to those in a minute. Firstly, let's go to the international developments here. The election in Zimbabwe. This is the first one after the coup d'etat of the former President Robert Mugabe. Incidentally, on Boston Red on the World, or BR on the World, we have an extensive interview with President Mugabe. He gave one on Sunday. Today, the people of Zimbabwe go to the polls. Zimbabwe was a country that was liberated from the clutches of the white supremacist Ian Smith by Robert Mugabe and other freedom fighters that had been there. The election pits Emerson Mnangagwa, a longtime ally, later to betray President Mugabe against a 40-year-old Nelson Chamisa, a lawyer and a minister vying to become the youngest head of state, Zimbabwe's youngest head of state. Former President Mugabe, as we said, held a news conference at the Blue House. That's the official residence of the president. And he explained everything from what happened in the election, why he's not voting for the ZANU-PF party, his party. And he encouraged people to vote for Nelson Chamisa. Hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. The candidate of the major opposition party there in Zimbabwe. We were looking at it earlier today. So the crocodile is slightly favored, but young voters there, urban voters, will go for Chamisa, no doubt about that. Chamisa is very articulate, period. And the voting started at 7 a.m. and it'll end at 7 p.m., relatively short. Chamiska's movement for democratic change, they called it. That was the movement that the principal opponent, Morgan Tsvangirai, who died of cancer in February. Tsvangirai was an interesting character there, but he became a puppet, unfortunately, of the West. And that was his situation there. He pulled out of the second round of election in an effort to end bloodshed. It was a contentious situation. Observers from the EU and the U.S., I don't know how the U.S. has the audacity to observe anything, and from the Commonwealth, Zimbabwe is part of the British Commonwealth. Period. Thus, the election is on. We'll cover it with some special coverage on all of our channels. Incidentally, you can find us on the iHeart Radio. There's 800 of those app on Stitcher. That app's a very popular map and becoming somewhat popular is something called Spotify. I had not heard of some music streaming service, but I suppose they're streaming us, which is good. We're also on YouTube. You can find our information on Twitter under the Boston Red Network franchise, and also on Facebook, where we primarily are spotlighting and sharing content from other parties, period. But let's move on here to the Boston story, a very big story here. Get the headline here on it. In the past decade, 10 years, 26,000 murders have gone without arrest in major American cities. Of those, 18,600 of victims, almost three-quarters were African Americans. Now, we have a dispute with the Washington Post in many of these, labeling African Americans black. Black has moved on African Americans to designate the African part of the population and to more accurately describe the ethnic group as being there, because there was a great controversy at one time within the African American community. There were some older African people that did not want to be called black. Justice Marshall, former Justice Supreme Court, late Justice Marshall, called himself an Afro-American. Well, that is okay. Afro-Caribbean, African-American, anyway, making progress. Dateline Boston here. Wesley Laurie, if you recall him from Ferguson, Missouri. And Kimberly Kelly, don't know Kimberly Kelly, Steve Rich. 5 years after Alcee Jackman was gunned down in the streets, his mother and 5-year-old brother walked into Dunkin' Donuts, a popular franchise in Boston, where the boy spotted a pit bull pup and dashed over. Kenesha Skinner gazed across her son and then settled on the man holding the leash. She met eyes. It froze. It was the same man who killed her Jackman. So in other words, the killer's walking around in broad daylight. Appeared she grabbed her son's arm, yanked him away from the man and back to their car. We all know who shot my son, and this is one of the things that happens in communities of color. People in the community do have the best evidence, many times because of historic problems with police forces and the quality of justice. The case is not pursued by the community. In the past decade, police in 52 of the nation's largest cities have failed to make arrests in nearly 26,000 killings, that's according to Washington Post analysis of homicide data. 18,000 of these cases were like Mr. Jackman, an African American. African American victims, who account for the majority of homicides, were the least likely of any racial group to have their killing result in an arrest. While police arrested 63% in the killing of European victims, they did so in 47% of African American victims. The failure to solve African American homicides fuels a vicious cycle. It deepens distrust of the police. Back to the Black Lives Matter movement. 4 cities, Chicago, Baltimore, Detroit, and Philadelphia, account for more than 7,300 African murders with no arrests. Even smaller majority European cities have amassed larger rosters of these cases during the past decade. 422 in Columbus, Ohio, 277 in Buffalo, New York, 183 in Nashville, and 114 in Omaha, known for steaks and Warren Buffett. In an interview with the Post, more than 24 police chiefs, homicide commanders said they work just as hard to solve African-American murders, and that is up for debate. No major American city has a wider gap of arrest rates between Europeans and African-Americans than Boston, where Jackman was killed last summer, where the killing of European residents was solved at twice the rate of African-Americans. The police chief there, William Evans, said, sometimes because a case goes unsolved, people get the perception that we forgot about their loved ones. We never forget about them. Typically called a cold case. Police in several cities say that some types of killings are easy to solve than others. Yeah, but definitely where there is a relative involved, husband, etc. Domestic violence cases and bar fights may present fewer hurdles to making arrests, while so-called gang-related shootings, drug-related killings, which are believed to account for the majority of unsolved cases, are more complicated. Let's face it, when you talk about a murder in our urban communities, black and brown, where gangs and group violence is prevalent, you got that retaliation piece. That's from James Craig. He's the police chief of Detroit. Those departments have an arrest record of has an arrest record of 12 percentage points higher for European victims than African American victims. Well, part of that is fewer European in the city of Detroit. That's one thing to know. Black lives are seen just as not important. That is from Dr. William Barber. He was a leader of the Poor People's March, a national leader there, who called a failure by police to solve African American homicides a civil rights crisis on par with questionable police shootings of people of color and wrongful convictions of African men. The African community gets cut by both edges of the sword. Dr. Barber, who until last year led the North Carolina chapter of the NAACP, there's no big rush to solve cases when it is considered quote-unquote black on black. But if it's an African-American on white killing, then everything is done to make an arrest. No doubt about that, because the apparatus is set up to do it. Survey identifies 5 cities that killing of African-American victims led to an arrest just as often or slightly more than the slaying of a European victim. That is Birmingham, Alabama, Durham, and North Carolina, Fort Worth, and Tampa, and Wichita, Kansas. We treat every homicide the same, regardless of where it occurs or who the victims are. That is from Devin Pitt. He's the police chief of Fort Worth, Texas. And he specifies neighborhood, a Latino neighborhood on the north side, and the African American neighborhood on the east side. Our neighbors still have enough trust in the police. Well, it's a different city, different time. A lot of that is how the police pursue people in Houston, Texas, very large city of millions, where police reliably track Hispanic victims, Latino victims. Officers were least likely to make an arrest in a homicide if the victim was Latino or Hispanic. That is from Art Ekvido. He's the police chief of Houston, Texas. And a lot of that's because of immigration problems, other things. Since 2007, Boston police have made arrests in 90% of the homicides of European victims, 42% of the homicides of African American victims, who account for a vast majority of the city's killings. Of 435 homicides, African American victims, 250 54 remain unsolved. Of that, 57 homicides with European victims. There's no question the African American community is victimized by this out of proportion. That's from Ed Davis, who was the Boston police commissioner to 2013, 2006, when he ends the tragedy of our time. We are not doing more to stop this. Well, a lot of it is resources and how things take place. The Boston Police Department sent some people to London to understand how they do it in London. It comes down to how resources are utilized, human resources, that is. Boston Police and city officials insist they're doing everything they can. That is something they do in every city. Detectives understand there's a real fear out there, no doubt about that. A long and troubled history. One of Boston's most persistent voices, Mary Frank. She ran for mayor. Her husband was killed down the street from their home late one night in 1996. He was walking home from Logan Airport, a job at Logan Airport, period. Frank has been very active. She's held press conference in the lobby of the police headquarters. I went through 20 years ago. She has a group there, Women Survivors of Homicide Movement Support and Advocacy Group. And the posts collected and mapped a decade of homicide data. We'll call that big data from dozens of American cities, chronicling 55,000 killings across 55 cities to date. The analysis of this story includes just 52. And let me finish this article up here. Across the 52 survey, the post analysis found racial inequality in homicide rates, no matter the location of the killing. An African American homicide was less likely to lead to an arrest. A lot of that is resources within the community. And back to a case in Boston, the town, Charles Stewart. He was a European who killed his wife in 1989. An unborn child. They ripped apart the whole community there and tore apart the block, then raided people's homes, and they searched young African Americans on the side of the road. All this for a guy that lied, and when he killed himself, his brother admitted that he lied. These kids were just being strip searched. They were in their 40s now. Jones said, and this was an unfortunate situation. There was a similar situation, I believe, in South Carolina. I can't recall the woman's name right now, but claimed that some African American kidnapped her and killed her baby. She killed her baby herself. Anyway, nonetheless, Janisha, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Skinner had spoken with her son just 10 minutes before he was killed. And Jackman had received his high school diploma and had enlisted in the Navy. Minutes after they spoke, she saw chatter on Facebook about the Blue Hill Avenue and found her son there beneath a sheet. A sad situation there that happened. And this is a situation that many people in the community know who the perpetrator was, and the perpetrator still lives in that community. A very unfortunate situation. Let me check on our time here. Okay. We'll move to sports. The reason we're doing this is fairly long, and we'll have to edit it more from the Sunday talk shows from ABC. There was a special panel there talking about a number of things related to the midterm elections in November. And let's do a little discussion of that, and also at Face the Nation. And they had their battleground tracker poll. Basically, the Republicans, the core group of the Republican parties, are still going along with DJ Trump to the tune of about 80% in the polls. And at the same time, the enthusiasm gap there, at least at this point in time. And this is something we question some of those measurements. Remember, this is coming on August now. We have September and October. Enthusiasm gaps can go up, can go down. It's sort of like in a football game that you don't want to get your enthusiasm up too much because people do tire out, specifically from fundraising. Might throw that in. But back to issues themselves, people cared less and had trouble getting their head around the Russian interference in the 2016 election. Number of reasons for that. For one, the Cold War is over. Two, it is a matter of foreign policy, and Americans as a whole pay very little attention to it. And also, it's a technical story that many people don't understand. Period. Now, if you equate that to the Hillary Clinton server, it was basically just seen as, by many people, as she had something she should not have had. They didn't understand the technical ramifications of it, other than she was up to something. And being, as they say, branded Crooked Hillary, it went along with the dialogue. But when you start talking about this whole affair with Russia, even in Helsinki with V.I. Putin, it doesn't register very high. The important issues are health care. People worry particularly about their health care. What is going to happen with Medicare and Medicaid that affect their day-to-day lives. And very popular theme with many Democrats now, Bernie Sanders spearheaded this, is Medicare for all. And many other Democratic candidates are endorsing some type of health care, quote-unquote, reform along the lines of fixing the Affordable Care Act and extending it. Period. So there's a little bit of division, but this division is very little. You can call it Medicare for all. You can call it a national health plan. You can call it the Affordable Care Act revisited, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't matter that much, as candidates endorse that more and more because the looming crisis is coming. No doubt about it. The other big issue is inequality in the economy has continued. Tax cuts have come, and more or less tax cuts have gone, but people find themselves further and further behind. Compensation of wages have not increased at the rate of inflation. And people understand this. This is basic bread and butter issues. Farmers are under the gun in spite of the $12 or $15 billion program DJ Trump come out. Incidentally, the Department of Agriculture suddenly produced that that farmers will be allowed to apply for that program in late August or early September. The check should come out in October. And this is based upon the current year's crop. In other words, it's a life type of saber thing being thrown to the farm community. And many Republicans have denounced it. In fact, Senator Johnson in Wisconsin as a Kremlin-type program, creeping socialism, etc. And he is somewhere on this. I believe he is on the CBS part of it, and his words that he has given to the whole idea of this subsidy. Republicans have been against all types of subsidies historically and moving to the free market. So in other words, the orthodoxy of the Republican Party has conveniently changed. And this is one of the caveats also in the Battleground Tracker that is from CBS News. So thus, the core issues are pushed forward as far as what Ocasio-Cortez is doing. That is in the Bronx. But similar programs are being run in other places. I mean, Kansas and various other places where Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez was. And she's also looking to a leadership position. This is a time to wish the veteran congressman from Atlanta, who was released from the hospital and had a situation on a flight. So, thus he is out there. But the thing to remember about the election coming up as we finalize our review of the Sunday talk shows, handicapping of them, that what matters is the bread and butter issues and issues to local people. Now, as far as the Mueller investigation is, if there is a report before the election, then people will look at it. But it's not the kind of story will last for weeks. Lucky to last for a few days, even if a report is out there. Stormy Daniels and all of that sort of stuff, that will probably come up after the election. And that's one of the big questions, the behavior of DJ Trump. Some people look at it and hold their nose. It's the same situation with the evangelicals that they see with Trump. He is the bus that is carrying them down the street, as LBJ would say. Because basically they are looking at conservative justices, so lifestyle does not change, and at the same time will enunciate their and amplify their social issues, i.e. abortion, GBTL rights, or the right not to bake a cake for a gay couple. It is preposterous and ambiguous, no doubt about that. But those are some of the kinds of issues that they're looking at, issues to keep the society as it was in the 50s. Will not happen, period. It's a pipe dream. And as one right-winger was telling me, well, when he was talking about the tax cuts, the corporate tax cuts will stick around and they may be reduced for longer than he perhaps conceded. But this whole right-wing movement that DJ Trump has out here is very tenuous at best. There was a meeting between he and A.G. Sulzenberger, who is the editor of the New York Times, about the plight of journalists. DJ Trump talking about fake news, and this whole thing of fake news, that's just a flippable as far as political consultants. It has a history that if the news is factual, you say it's not. So it's went to Lopenpressure, the German word for basically dirty journalists or dirty journalism. What do you want to Lopenpressure? Anyway, this is basically the same thing. It's a propaganda point. And if you can make people believe that the truth is fake, you can make them believe that. It serves your case. But the problem is, over the long haul, history starts to defeat you. So that's why you see now DJ Trump one day says one thing, and the next day he says another thing, and there's confusion in between. But what has happened, he's made the headlines not one day but 2 days. That's to be understood. And the monopoly media has to understand how to cover DJ Trump. The whole meeting with Sulzenberger was nothing more but capitulation to Trumpism. The reason for this is that in many instances, monopoly media, daily newspapers, TV networks, etc., have nothing else to cover. And he is the quote-unquote the news, carrying the day. And people get that. In fact, people call it openly entertainment of value. Let me go to the Hall of Fame very briefly here. The inductees: Jack Morris, through a special process. Alan Trammell, who played for Detroit. Jack Morris played
sooner
for
than
several.
Needs to be. So, it's nerve-wracking to say the least.
That was Skipper Jones. His wife is evidently due. That ceremony, incidentally, was on a Sunday. Vladimir Geronimo, another player out there. Clipper Jones. Trevor Hoffman. Trevor Hoffman was around. And let's see, big arguments are there. I was trying to figure out, and nonetheless, he's into Cooperstown one way or the other. I don't remember who he played for right now. Jim Thome. Those were the 6 inductees into the Hall of Fame. Of course, Clipper Jones played for Atlanta. Thome, Guerrero, and Jack Morris and Alan Trammell, they were all at one time with the Lions. A picture of them on our marquee on some of the channels here. And Thome played mostly for Cleveland. But they all sort of moved around a little bit here in terms of where they were at various times in history because of how modern baseball. Hoffman played for the San Diego Padres, and I guess he was also in Milwaukee. Not familiar with him, but Jack Morris, Game 7 of the World Series, barely made it to Cooperstown. He played in Detroit also. Won an award, that World Series, with the Minnesota Twins. Alan Trammell, of course, was with Cincy, and they all have a Detroit connection. Let me do the baseball scores on Sunday. The Rays and Orioles in Camden Yards. It was all Orioles. Orioles 11-6. The Twins were in Fenway Park, and they were shut out by the Red Sox 3-0. Kansas City was in New York. Yankees 6-3 over Kansas City. Cleveland was in the Motor City. Cleveland 8-1 over the Tigers. Let me make sure of it. Phillies and Reds in Cincy. Reds shut out the Phillies. A lot of shutouts. The Nationals and Marlins in Florida. The Marlins also shut out the Nationals 5-0. And Dodgers in Atlanta. Atlanta 4-1 over the Dodgers. The Mets and Pirates in Pittsburgh. 1-0 game there. Mets shut out the Pirates in their home stadium. The Blue Jays and White Sox on the south side of Chicago, 7-4 with the score. Toronto. The Rangers and Astros in Houston. Rangers 4-3. Athletics and Rockies in the Mile High City, 3-2 was the score. Rockies and Mariners and Angels in Southern California. Mariners 8 to shut out. Okay. And let's see. And now a game we tuned into, the Brewers and Giants. 8-5 was the final score. Giants, they won one out of the rubber, I guess you'd say. Nonetheless, the D-backs and Padres in San Diego, 5-4 to score there. D-backs. And finally, the night game was rain delayed. We sat through the whole game. Cubs 5-2 was the final score. The line score, Cubs 10 hits, and the Cards 5 hits and 1 error. Mike Shannon was right. It was one hell of a game. Anyway, this will do it for us. We'll have the Zimbabwe election, one of many of these channels that we're working on later as we cover it. And our open broadcast where we have call-ins,
to the midterm
we'll probably
elections.
have that
Plenty of things
on,
can change. I look at
as
100
it looks
days, and I
now
think
on
we'll
Wednesday
be
night.
90 and 80.
Have a good week, everyone.
Where are we today, and what are you seeing?
We're seeing an election play out across two different Americas. The battle for the House is taking place in the suburbs and the exurbs, 23 districts that Hillary Clinton won, where a Republican House member sits right now. And these are places where President Trump just isn't that popular. There was a meeting on Capitol Hill a few days ago where the White House said the president will go to any Republican district that he's wanted in. But there won't be a lot there'll be a lot off the map for him because he's just so unpopular. Meanwhile, the Senate is a totally different map. You've got 10 Democrats up for re-election in states that were carried by Donald Trump. And that's where Trump country is so powerful. So you could have the Democrats take control of the House, the Republicans keep the Senate, and both for the same reason, President Trump.
And Dan, the president says he's going to go out there and campaign 6 or 7 days a week, starting in a couple of months before the election. He wants the election to be about him. The Democrats want it to be about him. Should the Republicans want it to be about him?
Well, there are a lot of Republicans who will not welcome him in their districts because these are districts that, as Rick said, went for Hillary Clinton. But the reality is, at this point, Democrats appear more energized. I mean, everything we've seen over the last year plus in terms of special elections, Democrats have generally overperformed in terms of turnout and energy and that sort of thing. The one thing we know about Donald Trump is that he can rev up his base. And so he might even go into areas where he's not overall popular in order to try to encourage Republicans who may be a little bit lukewarm to get out there and vote. And he will try to make it in part about him. He will make it an us versus them, which he did in 2016.
And he certainly gets that energy going. Mary, you're always out on the road talking to voters, and I want to particularly focus on female voters and how you think they play in this.
All the fire is on the Democratic side. People that didn't go to PTA meetings are now organizing voters. They say that the one good thing that Trump has done is made them really fired up. The outrage at what's going on the border with kids, the feeling that the president has a loose relationship with the truth, the environment is just making people register to vote, give money to vote, getting other people out. And that's in big contrast to the women who say they're going to vote for Trump. They like Trump. But as they say, he may not be a good man, but he's a good president. And by that, then when you talk to them, they say they don't like his style, they don't like Stormy Daniels, they don't like how he tweets, and they don't even like that. What's this thing with Putin? They were saying, and so there's this discomfort, but they will vote for him. They're saying it as of today because of conservative judges, tax cuts, lower regulation, and that to them is what he's doing, is why they're still on his side.
And then how do you counter that? And I've seen that on the road. Mary and I have talked about this too. I've seen that on the road as well. I don't care about Russia. I don't care about,
Right.
the tweets. He's a means to an end.
Well, the big unknown, I think, is whether the Democratic and liberal energy in the country right now will actually translate into electoral victories. And we are seeing people more engaged in their communities, at PTA meetings, even, I would say, in primary contests. I mean, our primary contest in New York with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, that really suggests a level of participation in races where many voters didn't participate before. And so if that carries over, if you have voters who vote, who don't generally vote in primary elections, but do show up for presidential elections, well, we see them vote in the midterms.
But her race, and you saw me try to get to that with
Sure.
Congressman Lujan about is she and others like her taking the party too far to the left?
I think that it's definitely true that you have to know your district. So every district is different across the country. I mean, what plays in New York may not play in Alabama. But I actually think that Democrats have an opportunity to define themselves, and frankly, the Republican Party has gone so far to the right that some of the things that candidates like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are calling for, better paid leave policies. These are not necessarily radical things. They may work just as well in Alabama. And when we saw with Doug Jones, who won that victory? It was black women. I think Democrats really should consider doubling down on their base.
And it's not just Ocasio-Cortez. I mean, the broader context, what she's part of is not just a progressive wave. There's a pink wave. There's the record numbers of female candidates, and some of them are medical professionals, former fighter pilots, intelligence officers, incredible life stories that they're bringing. And a lot of that, I think, gets to the engagement of women in this election, where President Trump is just such a polarizing and energizing force.
And let's go back to those economic numbers and the GDP growth and all that President Trump was touting this week. But as you move closer to the midterms, is there a fear there? It seems like there really is with the Republicans that that trade war could come back and hurt them.
Well, Republicans are terrified of this. The one thing that they're worried about is that the economy takes a turn, and they're worried that the president could make it take that turn, either through a trade war or the government shutdown that he's tweeting again this morning. They feel like they have got a good argument to bring to the American people. Republican House and Senate candidates, they can tell them, look, things are going well, Trumponomics is working. If it doesn't, and I think there's real concern over that, then they lose most of their argument going into November. And
Dan, with 100 days out, what's your prediction here? And we all can go back and say, oh, I was wrong. And we'll do it with you if you're wrong. Okay, Dan? So go with that. What's your prediction here on what happens?
Well, we have learned that there's no upside to making predictions in the Trump era. But Rick and I were talking about this earlier. I think that if the Democrats cannot pick up the House in this environment, in a time when there is this much division and where the energy seems to be with them, I think that the questions that the Democrats will be having to answer on the day after the election will be very, very profound. And
what effect do we think you said you don't see the voters caring about Russia, but do you, Dan, think that has any effect at all?
I think it's a minimal effect. I mean, in all the conversations I've had, and Mary's had similar ones as we've been around the country talking to voters, people can't follow the ins and outs of this. I mean, we obsess about every small development and project out what it might mean, even though we're not sure what it ultimately will mean. Most Americans are not following it that closely. A lot of people have made up their minds one way or the other that either there was collusion and therefore the president should be impeached or in some way censured, and a lot of people saying, no, it is a purely political, it is a witch hunt in the way that the president has tried to characterize it. So I think those divisions exist, and I think it's difficult, absent some report by Bob Mueller, to change that.
People are
dynamic.
Just waiting that out. I want to lastly talk about the president and the press, and it's something I don't often like to bring up because I don't want to talk about us, but this week was different. President Trump used his address to the VFW, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, to attack the press. Some of those veterans booed the press. The White House Deputy Chief of Staff, Bill Shine, barred a credentialed reporter, a CNN, from attending a briefing, which is a pool report. For those of you who don't know what a pool report is, we have one representative go in to represent all the press. And this morning, the president is tweeting, had a very good and interesting meeting at the White House with A.G. Sulzberger, publisher of the New York Times, spent much time talking about the vast amounts of fake news being put out by the media and how that fake news has morphed into phrase, enemy of the people. Sad. You want to start, Dan?
Well, I mean, we have never seen a situation that we're in now in which the President of the United States has systematically tried to delegitimize legitimate fact-based reporting. And it is a political tactic that he has used from the beginning, in part to create a kind of an us and them environment. It has had an effect, but I think everything we saw this week adds up to that same thing, whether it was what he did at the VFW, as you say, or whether it was the way that Caitlin Collins from CNN was barred from an open event because they thought that she was acting improperly, which she was not. It is a worrying situation, I think, and I think that we all need to remind ourselves why there is a First Amendment.
But there was one important positive moment this week, and it may turn out to be kind of a little bit of the first time we're seeing a big pushback. The veterans in Kansas who were told by the President of the United States are in the foxholes, in war zones. journalists have exposed lies which sent our country to war at times in Vietnam. People remember?
Yeah, that particularly hit me. No doubt about that.
And veterans kind of say, hey, there is, it is the fourth estate. It is a check and balance.
And Mara, just quickly, your thoughts on that.
Sure. I just think somewhere along the way, we've, as an American people, forgotten or lost the sense of reality, which is that you don't have to like a certain network. You don't have to like or read a certain newspaper. But journalists are symbolic in a very real way of the people's right to know and the people's right to get answers and transparency about how its government works. We are the representatives of the people. And I just find the Trump administration's actions on this front to be an affront to the American people first.
Okay, beautifully said. Thank you
very much. We will be right back with a look at how those tariffs and the president's handling of them. And we've got some new CBS News Battleground Tracker poll numbers on the economy, trade, tariffs, and more. We're joined by CBS News Director of Elections and Surveys, Anthony Salvanto, to help us break it down. Anthony, I know you've been in the field, you've been crunching numbers. The president was very proud of this economic growth number he touted this week. Is it winning him political support?
Some. Look, optimism is high. Optimism is outweighing pessimism, especially for his voters, especially for Republicans and for people who say that they're doing better now financially. But, there's a little bit of broader context here for his overall ratings. He's still in the mid-40s in overall support. And part of the reason for that, despite the fact that so many people say the economy is good, is that first, Democrats are still a little bit leery to give him credit for the economy. And also, when people tell us that they're disappointed by his personal behavior, even if they think the economy is good, they're more reluctant to say that they approve of the job that he's doing. So some of that is sort of tamping down what could be otherwise higher numbers.
So people are still putting a political filter on this. It's not winning him new support or winning over skeptical Democrats.
One of the things we pollsters have been watching over the last few years is how much partisan ratings play into what would otherwise be objective measures, like the economy. People who don't like the party that's in power are more reluctant to say that the economy is good, even when it is.
On trade, though, because this is one of those complications we've been talking about. You had a good economic growth number, but you have this question of what the impact of the president's trade disputes will ultimately be. And the administration admitted this week that they know farmers are feeling some pain. That's why they put together this $12 billion aid package. So is the president's base still sticking with him?
Yes. What we find is that even folks, when we talk to them and they say that their jobs or their households are directly affected by things in the agricultural business, things in farming, they look like the rest of Americans in that they divide on partisan lines. The president's base is, at least in the short term, still with him. Republicans feel that these new tariffs will ultimately lead to better trade deals for the United States. Many say that they expect to see short-term pain. And there's a difference between that short-term pain and that potential for that long-term gain. For the moment, they say that they're willing to, or that they think that it's going to be okay, at least in the long run, even if they feel some pain in the short run. And part of that sort of puts them at odds with Republicans and a lot of conservatives who came out this week and said, what about the payments? What about to farmers? This isn't part of conservative orthodoxy. But what you see there is that a lot of folks aren't really very ideological. They're more practical. And Republicans tend to very strongly approve of the $12 billion payout.
Well, what you're highlighting there is another one of those divides between Republican orthodoxy, which on paper, if you're a conservative, you're not supposed to like picking winners and losers or market interventions or welfare, corporate welfare, so to speak. And yet, while you're hearing those Republicans behind the scenes or even on this show, people say they don't like it, you're not seeing voters peel away from the president based on that?
No. And look, part of this is, it is to a large extent the president's party now in this sense. Trade policy is often a complicated issue. And when we see complicated issues, people follow their elected leaders, the ones that they already support, as guidelines.
Even if it's voting against their own interests?
Well, we don't know yet that it's against their own interests. They feel, a lot of them say, even if they don't like what he's doing right now, they tell us that, A, it's a matter of principle, that should be what the U.S. ought to be doing. And also, they say that even if they don't like his particular approach, they say they're at least glad that he's trying. A third of folks told us that they were at least glad that he was trying. So it appears he gets some credit at least for that. And again, at least among his base. With everybody else, things are much more mixed.
The president said he's going to be out there campaigning like 6 days a week ahead of these November races. Does his popularity transfer to other Republicans, more traditional Republicans on the ballot?
It looks like that's one of the big questions going forward. Here's what we know. We know that Republican rank and file say that they would like their candidates to be in line with President Trump. Those numbers at 3/4 are much higher than, say, splits within the Democratic Party.
In line meaning don't criticize him?
They do not often like this. The strongest supporters do not like the president being criticized at all. His more conditional supporters are okay with that. His more conditional supporters, which make up about half of his overall support, are okay with the back and forth between him and members of Congress. The thing I think to watch, though, is voters across the board, including Republicans, say he's not a typical Republican. Mm-hmm. They like that about him. They say so. But does that mean that his popularity among the base, which is high, does that mean it transfers over to Republican members of Congress, Republican senators? That's the thing that we don't yet know.
Was there any political damage from this controversial meeting with Vladimir Putin of Russia?
Well, his base tells us that they would like to rush to his defense when they hear him criticized for handling Russia. There's really been a personal connection between them and the president all along. But we also do see that when we look ahead and we say, well, what happens if...
An examiner and is a columnist for the New York Post. So, Selena, best economic growth number since 2014. Does this make the president bulletproof?
For him, it's good news. You know, for the people that voted for him, they take a look at this and it reaffirms why for some of them stuck their neck out to vote for him, and for others why this confirms what they believed that he was going to do. In that they don't like these sort of multinational deals, they like these sort of bilateral deals. And so when he makes some of these trade moves, and you see the economy growing through the tax cuts and through deregulation and through energy growing, they're happy. They're very happy with what has happened. Now, does that transfer, I think, is important to wonder. Does that transfer into these House and Senate elections? Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we know that, but in that polling, it certainly shows that his supporters are still strongly behind him, and they back him even when sometimes he doesn't deserve to be backed. Like, most people will take a look at what happened in Russia and say, not exactly your best move, but they'll even still sort of back him on that. So they're happy right now.
Shannon, it seems an article of faith, though, because even as Larry Kudlow was sitting here, there's no actual agreement signed for any purchases of any kind of products at this point. There is no trade deal.
Right, and EU officials were pushing back a lot on the rosy picture that the White House was painting here. I think there's still a lot of questions we don't know about what the long-term or even short-term consequences of these tariffs are going to be. Remember, these are second quarter numbers. The full effect of these tariffs haven't been felt. They're just starting to be felt now. And when you look at some of these states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the manufacturing industries in those states are the ones who are going to feel this the most. And we're not just talking about GM, which put out very negative numbers this week because of these tariffs, but we're talking about a small company that makes aluminum foil labels, a company that makes washing machine parts because of the increase in cost of steel and aluminum. So I think this is a story that's just beginning to play out right now.
Ed, the president is tweeting this morning threatening a shutdown, presumably in September, over immigration. You add up what Shannon just painted in terms of a potential economic worry. You look at a shutdown. What does this do for other Republicans running?
Well, and what's weird about this is, or perhaps not surprising given how this president operates, is we heard from top congressional leaders who met with him this past week that they weren't going to have this fight, that the president had agreed to sort of punt on immigration into the lame duck session after the elections closer to Christmas because he understood that things were so fragile right now that it wouldn't make sense to have this kind of fight. Well, what did he do this morning but totally backtrack and say, no, we're going to have that fight yet again this year over $25 billion for a border wall, making sure that there's enough money for ICE. it's going to tie up Democrats who are having fights among themselves right now about immigration policy, but also potentially adversely affect a lot of those House Republicans who don't want to be seen as part of something like that when at a time when they're struggling certainly to build support and hold support.
And you heard Selena say, some people would look at what happened with this meeting with Vladimir Putin and say this was not the president's best moment, even if you are a big supporter. You had the Secretary of State in a very contentious hearing lay out what he could say publicly about that. And I know one of your colleagues defined it as an armed retreat from the president's policies. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think that's quite accurate. On the Pompeo hearing particularly, he was there for 3 hours and he advanced the knowledge of what happened in a 2-hour meeting, maybe this much, maybe. And as Senator Shaheen said, he kept going back to, here's what the policy is, and the policy hasn't changed. He's speaking not so much to Trump voters as to the Republican establishment. He's certainly speaking to the senators facing him in the room there with a message of nothing to see here, folks. Don't worry. Whatever that was, it isn't going to change the policy. And many of the senators said afterwards they're not really convinced that Pompeo himself knows what happened in that private meeting, despite Pompeo's assurances that he does. I think it very much remains to be seen whether some continuing discontent with how the president handled it becomes more of an issue in the elections this fall. We don't really see it so far. The strong partisan divide in that polling suggests that if you had whatever your opinion of his handling of foreign affairs in general, whatever your opinion of Trump and Russia, this didn't change it much.
Selena, it reminds me of something we were talking about when the president was on the campaign trail, which is essentially the Secretary of State was saying, don't pay attention to what the literal statements being made by the commander-in-chief, listen to me instead.
It's sort of that thing that I said when I interviewed him. Voters take him seriously, but not literally. But we take him literally and sometimes not so seriously.
Well, and what about foreign leaders? Who do you listen to? That was the problem Rex Tillerson got into, where he would say one thing and Trump would undercut him. And it's the dance Pompeo's doing, too, at that point.
Yeah, look, he has always sort of been a liberal with his use of words. And I think the literally, seriously thing has morphed into the Tuesday-Thursday Trump, where whatever he says on Tuesday could be completely different on Thursday, and nobody knows what happens in between. But something a voter said to me last week I thought was really, really interesting. She voted for Obama twice, and then she voted for Trump. And she said, look, for years, politicians have said the most wonderful things. Their speeches have been great. But I also understand that they've been massaged and focus grouped, and I didn't always get the results that I was promised. I don't like what he says half the time, but I love the results. And that's sort of the quandary that I think some voters face, because they see some of the results that they want. So, take a look at the regulations being pulled back, or with the Supreme Court justice, but they're not always really happy in the way he says things or his manipulation of the truth.
The reunification policy and ending the separation policy, the president, this was another retreat, but there are still 700 children or more who are left in detention facilities, not reunited with their parents. Does this stick?
It sticks with a certain segment of voters who I think are less supportive of the president, because they see this as the evidence of an incompetent administration, of a guy who doesn't care about certain segments of the country. And it could speak to those, especially the Democrats, who believe that there's a check and balance argument to make with voters here. That if there was a sharing of power in Washington, perhaps there'd be better accountability for the agencies who were implementing this and a better understanding of what went on. But But certainly, you know, if you're someone who doesn't like his immigration policies, you don't like him to begin with, and this is just you know, salt in the wound.
And you're right. I mean, midterms are like often are brake pedal elections, right? They want to put the power in check and get that balance in Washington, and that's the challenge that the Republicans face. How much do you think that people are motivated, not just Democrats, but independents and unhappy Republicans? How much are they motivated to show up and put those brake pedals on?
You know, I just wonder, you talk about family unification, you talk about the trade issues. These are not things that directly affect the everyday life of an overwhelming majority of Americans. They don't live by the detention center. They're not an immigrant. They're not a farmer. There's no issue right now that's really directly affecting people's either pocketbook or safety or something else. It's all about, what do you make of him? What do you make of the function of your government generally? And those are tougher arguments to pin down, and making it seem as if this is going to close far closer to November, I think.
And there was something that the Secretary of State was pinned down on in this hearing, and that was his admission that North Korea is still developing nuclear material. That directly contradicts what the president said.
Yes, and that left us this week sort of one up and one down on North Korea. They did actually begin the promised repatriation of American servicemen remains from the Korean War. That was something that Trump walked out of his meeting with Chairman Kim 6 weeks ago, saying would happen immediately. The North Koreans, as they usually do, dragged that out, but they did actually start doing it. But on the far more important question pertinent to the nuclear negotiation, yes, the U.S. government has now been forced to acknowledge what was pretty widely available through publicly available intelligence that North Koreans have continued. Most analysts expect North Korea to continue, and also to begin more seriously hiding some of the facilities and some of the capabilities that they currently have if these negotiations progress. The more they hide, the more they have potentially to give away later or save for later.
So why did the president open this new line of attack against Iran, at least rhetorically this week? Very quickly.
Well, you know, we were talking about Russia, and if you want to get someone talking about something else, why don't you threaten war against Iran? And then when we continued to press the White House on, is there a red line on Iran? What do you mean by this? Nobody in the administration seemed to have a clear answer for that. So, yes, this was all of a sudden, North Korea is not looking good. Relations with Russia aren't looking good. Let's turn our focus to Iran. But, of course, that argument hasn't stuck either, because the week has now been consumed by Michael Cohen and everything else Russia hacking related.
Shannon, thank you. We'll be right back.